into the Hansard. I now welcome the President of the Senate, Senator the Honourable Stephen Parry, the Clerk of the Senate, Dr Rosemary Laing, and officers of the Department of the Senate. I thank the Department for again providing the Committee with updated information on Senate committee activity. Senator Parry, do you wish to make an opening statement?
Thank you, Chair, I do.
Please proceed.
Thank you, Chair, and Senators. I take this opportunity to make an opening statement to the committee, and I can't help but note 9 years sitting on that side. I don't know which is more comfortable. I suppose I'll reflect at the end of the process. Firstly, Mr Chair, could I acknowledge and thank the Clerk of the Senate, Dr Rosemary Laing, the Secretary of the Department of Parliamentary Services, Ms Carol Mills, and the Parliamentary Budget Officer, Mr Phil Bowen, for the professional service that they each continue to provide to the Parliament, and in doing so acknowledge the efforts of all staff within those departments. Since becoming President, I have gained a new perspective on the amount of work that occurs by our parliamentary departments, the majority of it without any recognition, understanding or comprehension on the part of many of us. I sincerely thank them all. Mr Chairman, Parliament House security and related matters has been topical since my election to the presidency, and I wish to confine my opening remarks to that effect. My key priority with the Speaker of the House of Representatives is the security, safety and well-being of all persons within the parliamentary precinct. This is a responsibility that I certainly do not take lightly. It is sometimes worth a reminder that the Parliament, in particular the two chambers, are not sporting arenas or spheres where interjection, interruption, participation or disruption by visitors to the chamber galleries is tolerated. One of the freedoms that we continue to enjoy is that anyone can view live the proceedings of our Parliament. With this freedom comes the onus upon all visitors to respect the fact that the chamber proceedings and debates must not be interrupted. As presiding officers, we must diligently ensure that each chamber can operate without interference. Chair, on Thursday the 2nd of this month, I was advised that a group of people, some being male, were going to disrupt question time in the House of Representatives. The advice further indicated that this group would be wearing garments that would prevent recognition of their facial features and possibly their gender. As a result of this advice, coming to me via the usher of the Black Rod and the Speaker's office, the Speaker and I agreed to put in place temporary measures to ensure that such an event in the public gallery would not be disruptive, particularly where the identity of any person causing disruption would be difficult to determine. The Speaker and I always envisaged that this would be subject to further review. The Speaker and I met yesterday and replaced the interim measures with further measures. The effect of these new interim measures are primarily to ensure enhanced measures at the point of entry to Parliament House. This will be by way of identifying each person as they enter by their facial features and by enabling persons with facial coverings to move from that point freely into the public portions of the building, including the chamber galleries. An inhibiting factor prior to today was that visitors could enter the building with facial coverings and never be identified, particularly if they were a person that had been banned or a person who was known as a security threat. The reason why both sets of additional access arrangements are interim is because of the following. The presiding officers are constantly taking advice on access measures that are contingent upon other potential measures, such as the issuing and style of security passes and physical building changes. Also, should they wish, senators and members will be able to provide input and comment to the presiding officers. And finally, the potential for a change in threat levels at Parliament House could occur. Mr Chairman and Senators, I thank you for the opportunity to provide this statement, and I'm happy to take questions. And Chair, I have some copies of the statement which I'm happy to table if the committee would like.
Yes, if you wouldn't mind tabling that. Thank you, Senator Parry.
Thank you.
Dr Laing, do you wish to make an opening statement?
Thank you, Chair. Very briefly, Rosemary Laing, Clerk of the Senate. First of all, I'd like to introduce Rachel Callanan, new usher of the Black Rod, and I trust that most of you have met her by now. She started in June, and since then I think it's probably been the heaviest demand on a Black Rod ever known. So I'd like to acknowledge the tremendous effort that Rachel has put into settling into her position. I'd also like to note that the department's annual report was published last week, and I hope the committee has access to that. It's an account of the department's performance for the year ending 30 June 2014, and it records that we finished the financial year with a modest surplus, which is the expected outcome for the department in an election year where, in particular, committee activity does drop off significantly, and also our staffing numbers drop because we have fewer what are called non-ongoing or temporary staff on our books. I do recognise the tremendous work that all Department of the Senate staff have devoted to achieving that outcome. They have an amazing flexibility, work ethic and skill base that I feel proud of every day. This doesn't mean that our outlook in future isn't grim because of the compounding effect of the 2.5% efficiency dividend, and in consultation with the Appropriations and Staffing Committee, we are working on looking at ways of improving our funding base. As the Chair has acknowledged, I've also provided to the committee our usual statistics on committee activity compared with the comparable point in the previous two parliaments in accordance with usual practice. And finally, I'd like to inform the committee that as a result of a competitive process recently, the Parliamentary Budget Office has selected the Senate Department to perform certain of its corporate functions, including financial processing, payroll and records management functions, and we are currently working with the Parliamentary Budget Office on transitional arrangements which we hope will take effect on the 1st of December this year. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Dr Lang. And I should say on behalf of the committee, welcome Senator Parry, because as your first estimates as President, I should recognise that. Senator Wong.
Yes, I also recognise your first estimates, Mr President, and you can let us know how it goes.
Thank you.
Can I, there are obviously questions in relation to the security arrangements we'll be asking of the DPS, but given your opening statement and given also the involvement of officers of the Senate, I'd like to take the opportunity, as I'm sure other senators would, to ask some questions here. First, Mr President, in your statement you indicate advice you received on Thursday the 2nd, which was the day on which these so-called these interim arrangements were announced. Can I ask first why this was not referenced when you were asked in the chamber about these arrangements?
Well, it wasn't something I thought I'd raise in the chamber when you asked me that question. But that was the basis of the decision that we made, based upon that information.
I appreciate that, but if it was the basis of the decision, I just wondered why it was you chose not to share it with the Senate when you were asked directly about it.
I have no particular reason, Senator Wong, just simply that I answered your question on the spur of the moment. Maybe if I'd gone away and come back, it would have been included, but that was my answer on that.
Fair enough. Just for the record, whilst I appreciate not much notice was given the timing of it, my office did, I think, ensure that you were at least advised that a question would be asked.
A note was handed to me, I think, during the last question. I didn't read it until you were rising to your feet, but I was very comfortable to take the question. And you did give me the option not to take the question.
Sure. Ms Callanan, the President's just said that he was advised by, well, the advice came via you. Can I just start by making it clear? I mean, you are technically the person responsible for security of the Senate, is that right?
Rachel Callanan, Usher of the Black Rod. My role, among many, is to provide security advice to the Senate, senators, its committees and to the President.
Fine. Can I just, before I get to the specific incidents, just ask a little bit about process. Remind me of the formal processes, committee structures associated with the consideration of security matters for the Parliament and your role in those?
The Parliament has a Security Management Board that is created by legislation. The Security Management Board has the role of providing security advice in relation to security policy and the management of security operations to the presiding officers.
And just remind me who's on the Security Management Board?
The Security Management Board comprises 3 people. The first is the Chair of the Board, who is the Secretary of DPS, and then 2 nominations from the presiding officers from their respective departments. Currently, those are myself from the Department of the Senate and the Sergeant-at-Arms from the Department of the House of Representatives.
Sure. Did the committee meet at any time to consider the interim arrangements which the President has referenced?
The committee did not meet prior to the first decision on the 2nd of October. No, it did not.
Right. Can we go to the...
Could I just ask that?
Sure.
Well, could I ask you, Blackrod, and congratulations on your appointment, which I think you took up in June.
Yes, I did. Thank you, Senator.
How many meetings of the Security Management Board have there been since June?
Since June, since I've taken up the position, there have been 2 meetings of the Security Management Board.
I see. And can you say, please, could you indicate to the committee when those meetings were held, please?
Yes, I can. There was a meeting on the 11th of June. There was a meeting on the 23rd of July.
So 23rd.
23rd of July.
Okay, so the Security Management Board...
Sorry, excuse me, can I just correct that? In the period that I was here, there was a meeting on the 23rd of July and the 15th of September, excuse me.
So, 23rd of July and the 15th of September.
That's correct.
So, the President, I think, Mr President, you made your announcement to the Senate, and the new security arrangements were put in place on the 2nd of October, have I got that right?
Correct.
So, in fact, for at least 2 weeks prior to that date, and since that time, the Blackrod, I want to be clear on this, is a Blackrod, are you saying to us you didn't attend the Security Management Board, or the Security Management Board, to your knowledge, hasn't met? Just for clarity, I think you're saying the latter, but we always need to be clear on these things.
That's correct. The Security Management Board has met on the dates that I mentioned.
Thank you. So let's be clear here. You, Mr President, announced to the Senate concerns about the events, the prospective demonstration or action of disruptive activity, if you like, on the 2nd of October. The Security Management Board, in charge of security at Parliament House, hadn't met for 2 weeks prior to that, didn't meet on that day, and hasn't met since. Have I got that right, Mr President?
Well, in part you have, Senator Faulkner. Firstly, the Security Management Board, I think, and I stand to be corrected by the clerk or the Blackrod, meets around about 6 or so times a year. It is to provide advice to the presiding officers. That is the formal meeting of the Security Management Board. On the 2nd of October, all members of the Security Management Board were present in the Speaker's office when we devised and designed the interim arrangements.
Well, I'll come to that in more detail a little later, but the point that I'm making is correct. The Security Management Board has not met at least 2 weeks prior to the possible disruptive activity on which you took the action you announced to the Senate, and since. No one's seen fit to call it together.
That is correct. As a formal Security Management Board, yes.
Why, can you assist me as to why the Security Management Board hasn't met during that period?
No, I can't. I mean, you would need to ask the chair of the Security Management Board, but I reiterate that the members of the Security Management Board have met with the presiding officers outside of the formal meetings.
Well, the chair's Ms Mills, the Secretary of the Department of Parliamentary Services, so probably someone in DPS will be listening to this, given the amount of preparation that DPS, I understand, puts into Senate estimates, in the amount of resources they expend on Senate estimates. So no doubt I'll be able to ask her that a little later, and she'll have notice of the question. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So Can we just go, so I think we're clear about the official meetings or the meetings of the board, which also, just to confirm, hasn't met to consider the information circular which was released today, is that right?
Well, again, Senator Wong, formally the board, well, I understand from the evidence given by the Black Rod, formally the board has not met. However, again, the members of the board with the presiding officers met yesterday.
Okay.
So, you know, well, let's be clear about formal meetings of the board and meeting with the board members in their capacity to providing security advice.
Let's go to that.
But you'd expect with such an important issue, and I think anyone would acknowledge, I think it's a fair thing to say this has been a matter of quite significant public notoriety. I think you'd acknowledge that, yes. Mr. President. We haven't enjoyed it, and I understand that. But in that circumstance, I must say I find it remarkable that no one has seen fit to bring the Security Management Board, which is the primary decision maker and authority on security matters at Parliament House, together. It didn't meet for 2 weeks prior to the possible disruptive activity, and it hasn't met since.
Senator Faulkner, you're making a distinction between a formal meeting of the board and interaction with the board receiving security advice outside of the formal board meetings.
So you can assure me that at all times, all members of the Security Management Board were present when decisions were made in relation to the matter on which you made the announcement in the Senate.
On the one on the 2nd of October and the one today, the Security Management Board members, not meeting as a formal board, were present with the presiding officers when decisions were taken. Okay.
And was it done on the basis of, did you have formal advice? I mean, was there actually a formal advice, in other words, a written advice that that you and the Speaker of the House of Representatives were able to access?
Well, advice came in all sorts of forms, be it verbally on the spur of the moment or be it written advice. So it would have come in all forms, Senator Faulkner.
But was there written advice?
Written advice in particular in relation to the interim arrangements, both the 2nd of October and of today. Well, written advice was coming in the form of even draft circulars, so I would call that written advice. So, you know, a formal letter written to the Speaker and I indicating some formal requests or desires or opinions, no.
Yeah, but the draft circulars. So this might be better to be asked when DPS is at the table. I accept that because I assume any written advice would come from DPS. It obviously wouldn't come from the Black... well, can you confirm it would come from the Department of Parliamentary Services, not from either the Sergeant-at-Arms in the House of Representatives or the Usher of the Black Rod in the Senate?
Well, as presiding officers, we would take all forms of advice, verbal or written, from any of those three parties.
Yes, but what I'm trying to understand is, before the decision was taken, before the announcement was made, was there a formal advice before the presiding officers?
Well, if your definition of a formal advice is a written communique, signed and giving us formal advice, the answer is no.
So there was no brief?
Yes, there was a brief. The presiding officers have signed off on both occasions on a brief from the Department of Parliamentary Services, countersigned by the Black Rod and the Sergeant-at-Arms on both occasions for both
Senator Parry, may I just interrupt Senator Faulkner just for a moment? There's some concerns about the distractive nature of the photographers clicking away, and so the Secretary is just making some appropriate arrangements. It's only fair for the witnesses to be able to give their evidence undistracted.
Well, Chair, we have allowed photographs.
Yes, no, I know we have Senator Wong, but...
is it the position?
I'm not sure. The Secretary is just establishing exactly what's going on. So
I'm generally happy for press to stay. So what's the
no, we
ruling?
don't particularly have a problem with the press staying. We want to make sure that the witnesses are not distracted. That is the term. I've had someone make a request.
Perhaps ask them to purchase quiet cameras.
Perhaps those shutters, you could indeed.
Well, Chair, a number of us have been in these committees, including on that side of the table. Let me tell you, this is not unusual, as you know, when things are...
Perhaps this level of interest is somewhat unusual.
Well, no, I've been in committees where there's been probably more cameras than this, and I mean, generally we have a view about, as I understand it, Chair, people can ask for the photographers and cameras to be in certain positions. That has been asked before, but I'm not sure that the noise of shutter clicking has been...
The Secretary has asked for the photographers to conclude their photography within the next few minutes. The photographers have kindly agreed to that. So...
I didn't think I was given a choice.
Well, Chair,
we don't need comments from photographers in the Estimates Committee.
He just indicated he wasn't given a choice. I don't know why you would be worried about people taking photographs in the Senate Estimates Committee. These committees have been...
Senator Wong, I've had a
Chair,
request...
I find it extraordinary that you're going to kick out the cameras. I just find it extraordinary. I've never heard of this before. Usually what happens is they get asked to be put in a certain place.
That's right.
That's fine, but to kick out the cameras is an extraordinary... the estimates are a public event. They are and should be here. So who is... is there...
Senator, I value your contribution, I genuinely do, but I was merely informing the witnesses and the committee that a request has been made. They have agreed to that.
Who's the request from?
They have agreed.
The committee should have a private meeting and determine it, and that's the general way it occurs. It's not something that one request trumps everybody.
Well, you see,
estimates is a public event.
Indeed, it is, Senator Ludwig. But you know, we can try and facilitate these things and reach agreement. Agreement has been reached, apparently, except for you. And for Senator Wong.
Well,
the photographers...
I remain with my objection.
Can I go on with some questions then?
Well,
have we
resolved this?
Well, you've got the numbers you rolled us before on witnesses. I presume you'll roll us again on this. So,
yeah.
What is it about democracy that you don't like?
Well, the lack of transparency imposed without reason from the government. That is what I object to. But if I could, can I ask questions, Chair?
Senator Wong, I will ask you to conclude your questions. We can come back to you, but there are other senators that have questions.
Well, Senator Faulkner has been asking questions.
You were given the call first off, and if you give your time to Senator Faulkner, we will come back to you.
This is very fair chairing early on.
Shut down transparency.
Thank you.
Normal process?
Well, this is an important matter, and a matter as Leader in the Senate Chair. I asked the President, so I'd ask you if you could just indulge me for a bit. I will just ask a number of questions about the two circulars, and I'm happy for you to change the call. So I'm asking for that courtesy. Thank you. So can we go through the process, and I'll come back to it again with DPS. But first, this process around the 2nd of October and then the 20th of October circulars. First, Ms Callanan, would you prefer me to call you Black Rod? You don't mind?
Callanan's fine,
okay.
Thank you.
The President's statement says you provided him with advice, or the advice came to him via you, in relation to a group of people who are going to disrupt question time in the House of Representatives. When did you receive such advice?
Yeah. I received a call mid-morning on that day from the Parliamentary Security Operations Manager, and he informed me that he had become aware that there was a film crew on the forecourt of Parliament and that they were there in anticipation of a group of people wearing burqas who were going to attempt to enter Parliament House.
So this was at on the day of the 2nd of October?
That's right.
That was the first time you became aware of it?
Yes, it was.
And what did you do as a result of receiving that advice?
I communicated that advice to the President's office, to his Chief Advisor.
Right. Did you have any conversations with the Speaker's office or the Sergeant-at-Arms?
No, I did not.
And when on that day was there a meeting held?
You're referring to the meeting that the President referred to?
Okay, let's take it in steps. After that advice is received and transmitted to the President, and it's in the form that you've just described. So a Parliamentary Security Officer says there's a film crew out the front and the information is there may be a protest of some kind.
As I said, I was informed that there was a film crew at the front of Parliament House on the forecourt and that they were there in anticipation of a group of people wearing burqas attempting to enter Parliament House, something to that effect.
Enter Parliament House?
Yes.
Was the advice at that stage that there would be a disruption of question time?
That was not the advice that I was given at that stage. I was just informed as I described to you.
I'm sorry, could you say that again?
I was informed by the security manager, as I described to you, that they were, the film crew was there in anticipation of a group of people wearing burqas who were going to enter Parliament House.
Who were going to enter Parliament House, but
Yes.
to the best of your recollection, there's no discussion in that conversation with the officer that there was an intention to disrupt question time. Is that right?
No, to the best of my recollection, no.
Okay. What is the next occasion? So you've said you indicate that to the President's staff.
Yes.
Just can you tell me who you spoke to?
That was the Chief Advisor.
Thank you. And what's the next communication? You know, in person or by email or verbal that occurs in relation to this topic?
The next communication I had in relation to the topic was to speak with the Chief Advisor. A short time afterwards, I spoke to him about some other matters I needed to speak with him about. We spoke again about that matter. And then we went to speak with the President about it as well.
So there's a meeting in the President's suite?
Yes.
Between whom?
The initial meeting was between the advisor and myself, and then we went into the President's office and spoke with him.
Right, so at this stage it's on the Senate side only and there's
Yes.
no House of Representatives, officials or representatives from the Speaker's office present?
That's correct.
And about what time did this meeting occur?
These events were all happening between, I think, approximately 10 a.m. and onwards.
Okay.
So this may have been something like 11, something like that.
And then after that, are there any further sub-meetings at which you're present or communications which you're party to?
Yes, subsequently I was asked to attend a meeting that was being held between the presiding officers and a number of departmental staff, and I was asked with the Sergeant-at-Arms to attend that meeting.
Right. About what time was that meeting?
I'll just refer to some notes I've got. I think it was about 12 o'clock.
Right. And where was that meeting?
That was held in the Speaker's suite.
Okay. Were there any staff from ministerial offices present at that meeting?
No, I don't believe so. There were staff from the President's office and from the Speaker's office. There was at least one of those staff that I had not seen before, so I'm not sure who that person was.
Were there any ministerial staff present at that meeting, Mr. President? No. And in that meeting, what was discussed?
When I came into that meeting, I was informed that there was a proposal under consideration to introduce some additional measures. Those measures were described to me, and they were the ones that were the topic of the following circular.
So is this the first occasion on which the Usher of the Black Rod, who's responsible for Senate security, is advised of the revised arrangements for the public galleries?
Of the proposal, yes, it was.
Right.
And who informed you of that, please?
It was either the Speaker or the President. I'm sorry, I can't quite recollect who it was that described the proposals that were being discussed.
These are the interim measures?
Yes.
Were they described as interim measures at this stage?
I'm sorry, I can't quite recollect whether they were or they weren't.
Can I ask, at which point in this process was Dr Lang informed? Dr Lang, you can answer if you wish.
It was...
Oh, well, firstly, of the Parliamentary Security Officer advice, were you informed of that prior to the changed arrangements?
I don't believe I was.
No, after that meeting was held, and I came back and I had...
Sorry, which meeting?
So after the meeting in the Speaker's office,
Sure.
after that, I came back and I informed the Clerk and Deputy Clerk of the discussion that was had.
So, Dr Lang, was that the first time you were aware of the proposal to change the arrangements for the public galleries?
Yes, it was, Senator.
So you were never asked for your views prior to that, obviously?
I wasn't, but nor would I expect to be necessarily.
At which point, Ms Callanan, did you first hear the suggestion that the protest or the group of people, shall we use a non-pejorative term, were not only going to enter Parliament House, but there was an intention to, quote, disrupt question time, end quote?
I think it was in that meeting.
From whom?
From the discussion that was being had. I can't remember who specifically mentioned that.
Was there a formal brief before that informal meeting?
There was a document that was being discussed. Yes, that was a written document prepared by the Department of Parliamentary Services.
Were you given a copy of that?
I was at that meeting.
Have you kept it on file?
Yes, I have.
Would you be able to provide that to the committee, please?
Yes, I would.
Thank you. Can I just ask? Sorry, Senator Wong. And was that the effectively recommend the final form of the announcement or that was made in relation to new security measures?
The document that I was shown in the meeting recommended, if I recall correctly, there were 2 of those proposals that were in the document, and following the discussion that was had in the meeting, the document was amended to include the 3rd recommendation.
So, and when you say the 3rd,
The 3rd being what ended up being being announced on the 2nd of October.
which is persons. The 3rd being persons with facial coverings entering the galleries of the House of Representatives and Senate will be seated in the enclosed galleries. This will ensure that persons with facial coverings can continue to enter the chamber galleries without needing to be identifiable. It's 3rd because, is that what we mean?
Yes, that's correct.
Item C, yeah.
Item C, that's correct.
Oh, so the document which we'll table from DPS proposed, just so I understand this, 2 options. Is that right? Two potential arrangements, changes to arrangements. It did not propose the option which was announced on the 2nd, which was, as Senator Faulkner indicated, that option was added as a 3rd option in the course of the meeting.
That's correct.
Who added it?
It was added after the discussion in the meeting and the decision of the presiding officers to implement that 3rd decision, and then it was redrafted by DPS to include that recommendation.
Was it a proposal from the presiding officers?
It was the presiding officers who had made the decision to make that determination in relation to the chamber galleries.
So the 3rd option that wasn't part of the initial brief?
No.
Did you see the final draft before it was made public?
I did see the final draft, yes.
Were you involved in the process of establishing the precise terms of item C of the circular?
No, I wasn't.
Perhaps one more minute before I move on to another senator.
Well, I might need to come back to this. When you say you weren't, were you well, can you explain the circumstances why you weren't involved in that part of the decision-making process, please?
Sure. As I mentioned, I was informed of the proposal when I came into the meeting, so prior to that I had not been aware that that proposal was being proposed. During the meeting, the presiding officers made the decision in relation to that 3rd proposal, and then they requested the Department of Parliamentary Services to include that proposal in the document that was ultimately prepared for their signature. And I did not have input into making that amendment.
So as a member of the Security Management Board, you weren't involved in determining the 3rd element of the announcement that was made. I just want to get this right, because I think that's how I'm interpreting what you're saying, but I don't want to make an unfair interpretation.
No, I understand.
Of course.
Yep. The extent of my involvement is, as I described, when I was informed of the proposal, I was also asked my views in relation to that proposal. So I was given a brief opportunity to provide some comments about the proposal, and so that was the extent of my involvement.
And you did express views?
I did.
And are you able to share those views with us? Or?
In the sense that the advice I give to the President, as with any senator, are given on a confidential basis, I think it might be incumbent upon the recipient of the advice to indicate whether he's okay with me to...
And that's a perfectly proper and reasonable response, Blackrod, and I'd expect you to respond in that way. So I might ask the question of Mr. President.
Senator Faulkner, I'm going to...
We'll come back.
We will come back to you. Well, Senator Wong had one more question, and there are other senators that have this.
Back to us after you've done your...
Okay, that's fine.
Because I've got quite a lot more, Chair.
Yeah, that's fine, Senator Wong, but Senator Faulkner, last one.
No. Well, I've just... Ms Callanan, in my view, quite correctly and professionally has indicated, given that she's provided advice to the President, has informed the committee of that, and I've now asked the President if he's able to assist us in relation to advice from the Black Rod of the Senate.
Thank you, Senator Faulkner. What the Black Rod has indicated is correct, her version of events, and she did provide advice by way of comment to the presiding officers, and we noted her advice.
Yes, but I was asking about the nature of the advice, Mr. President.
Well, look, I don't particularly want to go into the details of anyone's advice to the presiding officers, but the advice was given and it was noted.
Yes, you see, I'm trying to get behind the processes here, which we haven't had meetings of the Security Management Board. You indicated that members of the Security Management Board were present. I'm just trying to establish, given there have been no formal meetings of which I find quite extraordinary, during this period of the Security Management Board, whether there was a unanimity of view in relation to these matters. Because there's no formal meeting of the Security Management Board, you've indicated that there's been members present. I think it's reasonable in these circumstances for me to ask, I'm not asking you about the view of the Sergeant at Arms. I will ask when the Secretary of the Department of Parliamentary Services is at the table, about any perspectives she might have had, but I think it's reasonable to ask you in relation to the Black Rod of the Senate, because there's no formal meetings.
Well, that's right.
You're depending on all the informal processes.
Senator Faulkner, you rightly described it as extraordinary because these events occurred in a relatively short period of time, and I think it shows that the presiding officers exercised good judgment by inviting the Black Rod and the Sergeant to be part of that process.
Anyway, the Chair was keen to give call to another Senator, so we'll come back to that. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator Smith, just before I go to Senator Smith, it's 9:45. We are scheduled to move on, but the standing orders of the Senate preclude us from moving on to other agencies until all questions have been completed or senators have agreed to put them on notice. I suspect we're going to be somewhat delayed on this department. Senator Smith.
Thank you, Chair. I do have some questions in regards to other issues, but sticking with this theme, can you just, Ms Callanan, just remind me again, who is on the Security Management Board?
Yes, Senator. The Security Management Board comprises 3 departmental officers. The first is the Chair of the Board, who is the Secretary of the Department of Parliamentary Services. The 2 other officers are nominated by the presiding officers from their respective departments, and currently those are myself and the Sergeant at Arms.
I don't want to be discourteous, but none of those people are what I would call people with practical policing experience.
That is correct.
Were you surprised on coming to the Senate and joining the Security Management Board of the makeup of that committee?
No, Senator, I wasn't surprised. Before joining the Senate, I was aware of the nature of the Security Management Board. I was also very familiar with the role of the Usher of the Black Rod, having been the Usher of the Black Rod in the New South Wales Legislative Council, and I was aware of the role of the Usher on the Security Management Board.
Right. So you had some familiarity with the Security Management Board in this Parliament?
Yes, I did. Well,
Right.
familiarity with the role and familiarity with the role of the Usher in relation to security in the previous Parliament that I worked in.
Why then is there no policing representative? For example, why is there no representative of the Australian Federal Police?
The Security Management Board and the legislation under which it's created also contains the provisions to invite representatives from relevant agencies, including security and justice agencies, for example. And my understanding is that in the past, representatives of a number of agencies have attended meetings of the Security Management Board, and then they do so to provide their technical expertise to the board.
So attending meetings, of course, is different from being a member.
Yes, that's correct.
Are you familiar with any previous practice of having a policing representative as a member of the Security Management Board?
To my knowledge, they haven't been members of the board as such. The board has been was created, I think, in 2005, thereabouts. And at that stage, it was the composition was the same as it is today.
Right. So the Australian Federal Police, for example, what has been their participation in the Security Management Board?
I'm advised that would be a question for the Australian Federal Police. It's certainly, in a practical sense, it predates my time here in the Senate.
But it could also be a question of the chair of the committee,
yeah,
the secretary of the DPS.
Yes.
That's right.
Yeah.
So, but given you've been in the role for a little while now, given that security issues have been top of mind for many people, are you aware of any discussions about the presence and participation of the Australian Federal Police?
On the Security Management Board? Yes, I am. In fact, I'm aware that the presiding officers have recently written to the AFP and inviting them to nominate a representative to attend meetings of the Security Management Board. Have
the AFP previously been members of the Security Management Board?
They haven't previously been members, Senator, to my knowledge, but to my knowledge they've previously attended some meetings in the past, but in terms of the detail I might ask you to refer those decisions to the Secretary of DPS, who's got longer continuity on the board than I do.
Right. There's a suggestion, it might have been in a media report, I don't know, that the AFP haven't been involved in the Security Management Committee since March of 2013. Is that true?
I'm not sure if that is or isn't the case. I could take that on notice or suggest that you refer that question to the Secretary of DPS.
And she will be attending here. I would be interested to know if that is true, why the Australian Federal Police ceased participating from March 2013, how and why they removed. I note your response to my questions that they've now been invited to be not just participate but to be a member?
No, they've been invited to nominate a representative to attend meetings of the Security Management Board.
Right.
The legislation stipulates the membership of the board, so they could only be invited to be attending.
Right. And of course then, what level of representation from the Australian Federal Police would be expected? Are we talking about a constable?
My understanding is that it would, the request was that they be from the Assistant Secretary level. I would have to take that on notice to make sure that's accurate.
Right. So we're not able to confirm that the AFP has been an active participant on the Security Management Board since March 2013.
I would ask you to refer that question to DPS, or I could take it on notice, but they would have the information.
Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Senator Smith. Senator Lowenhelm.
Thank you. I think my question is addressed to Senator Parry, President. In your statement on the 2nd of October, you said, these are the reasons that these interim measures have been placed into the Parliament House precinct until we get a firm set of advice from some key agencies, including the Australian Federal Police and ASIO, with whom we have discussed this matter earlier in the week. Could you just elaborate on that? What sort of discussions occurred and what were they about?
Yeah, thank you, Senator. I was at a meeting with the Speaker and the Prime Minister where we had the head of ASIO and the head of AFP, the Acting Police Commissioner, where we discussed security matters, in particular relating to the parliamentary precinct.
Was it in anticipation?
Are we able just to get a date on that meeting?
That was from Hansard on the... Oh, sorry.
The date of the meeting?
I believe it was the Wednesday of that week or the Tuesday of that week, Senator Wong, but I can confirm that. It was earlier in the week.
Tuesday or Wednesday of the week in which you announced the interim
Correct.
measures. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Senator Wong, I'll come back to you and confirm that date.
Thank you. Was it in anticipation of the advice that the Black Rod has said she became aware of on the morning of Thursday the 2nd? Did you get prior warning that there was something was coming?
No, it wasn't related to that matter.
So, coincidental meeting?
I'd been meeting with the head of ASIO, the head of AFP and representatives from PMO and AG several times prior to that meeting as well. So this was an ongoing matter concerning security at Parliament House, but not relating to that incident or the potential threat on the Thursday.
Understand, thank you. Have there been instances where an interjector couldn't be identified because of a face covering in the past?
I don't believe so, no.
Given that the concern was controlling interjections rather than just simply security, is that a matter for ASIO and AFP? I mean, who would you seek advice from in relation to a matter like that?
That's in relation to the further advice, and it's still ongoing advice, Senator, in relation to all matters concerning security at Parliament House, and that's why the interim advice or the interim measures would have been put in place because of continuing advice we're receiving.
On that then, has consideration been given to the precedent for other venues where there are concerns about interjections, such as at conferences or universities or in courtrooms?
Look, I think that's beyond my scope, Senator, but certainly not from my perspective.
All right, thank you.
Concluded, Senator Milne.
Thank you, Chair. So just to follow up on Senator Lanhelm's questions there, in the meetings that you had with the Federal Police and ASIO, were matters related to sponsored passes and escorted passes, the A and B, in other words, on your information circular, were they matters that had been discussed?
There were a series of meetings, Senator Milne, that went over a period of weeks, and then on top of that, the implementation of the Security Task Force. These matters, and ASIO and AFP were present at, I think, virtually all of those meetings. These matters have come up in general context, and different subgroups of the task force are attending to aspects, particularly involving the DPS in relation to passes. So, okay. Yes, the matter has been raised, but I can't specifically say where and when, and as you would appreciate, I won't be going into the detail of the matters discussed at those meetings.
I just wanted to establish that in the draft advice that you would have received, and on the back of the Federal Police and ASIO, the issue of the passes in both categories had been raised previously, as you've just said. Was the issue of facial coverings ever raised by the Federal Police or ASIO?
Well, I think it's probably appropriate that I don't comment on the details of those conversations and those briefings, majority of which occurred in the secure briefing room, so that in itself would indicate that these matters shouldn't be discussed outside of that area. But in general, in the task force meetings, all matters of security are considered and have been considered.
What I'm trying to establish here is from the evidence that the Black Rod has given, the meeting that occurred at some time after 10 o'clock on the 2nd of October, in the draft that was provided to you, there was no reference to covering of faces or face coverings, and that the presiding officers made that decision. Given that if that had been something that had been part of the discussions and so on, you'd assume it would have been brought forward as part of the draft. So I'm asking you, had you had any discussions with the Speaker of the House of Representatives prior to coming to this meeting in the Speaker's office on sometime after 10 o'clock on the 2nd? Had you had any discussion with the Speaker prior to that meeting with regard to the issue of facial coverings?
I've had many discussions with the Speaker in relation to all security matters, and that would include facial coverings.
So you had a discussion with the Speaker prior to that meeting on facial coverings?
Yes.
And what was the nature of those discussions?
I'm not going to discuss the nature of the discussions that I've had with the Speaker in relation to those matters.
So in the meeting that you had on that morning where point C was added, was it your idea to add that, or was it the Speaker's idea to add that?
Senator Milne, in relation to that entire circular, it is the responsibility of both presiding officers to sign off on every point, including the third point, and that was discussed at that meeting. And that's as far as I wish to take the matter in relation to the discussions concerning that particular security circular that was issued that day.
So let me put it another way. Had you and the Speaker made a decision to ban facial coverings prior to going to that meeting in the Speaker's office at which all the other people were present?
The answer clearly to that is no.
Okay, you hadn't made that decision beforehand. Can you tell me whether you had any correspondence or contact with anyone from the Prime Minister's office prior to that meeting in the Speaker's office with regard to the issue of facial covering?
No, I had not.
Did you have any contact or with any other minister or ministerial office prior to that meeting?
No, I had not.
So since you had no contact from the Prime Minister's office, do you know if the Speaker had discussions with the Prime Minister's office?
Well, that's a matter for the Speaker, but can I just indicate this? The Speaker and I, with the Prime Minister's office and the Attorney-General's Department, the Prime Minister and Cabinet, ASIO and AFP have determined that all initial communication concerning security will be directed to the Speaker's office, which makes perfect sense. The Speaker is the chair of the task force, and rather than having both presiding officers constantly being informed of the same thing, it goes to one particular office, and then the senior staff of both offices communicate regularly on those matters. So all original communication would go to the Speaker's office.
Okay, so on that basis, if a decision on banning facial coverings was under active consideration in the Speaker's office, and you said that that was by way of, that matters would come by way of communication, did I hear you just say, to your senior staff?
That's right. If we need to meet, our two senior staff members would communicate and we would meet. And the Speaker and I meet on an ad hoc basis. We have done more so probably in the last few months due to security arrangements than other matters. But we meet on an ad hoc basis and our staff are in constant contact in relation to these matters, or indeed the Speaker and I would talk if we need to.
So in relation to the Speaker and yourself discussing the issue of facial coverings, over what period of time have you been discussing that?
Well, Senator, it's in the mix of everything, and it's not a focal point. In fact, it would be a very small aspect of our overall discussions, and that would have occurred over a number of weeks.
So since it was a small part of your discussions, and since you as the presiding officers made the decision to add the issue of the facial coverings on that day, what changed for you and the Speaker such that you then, without the advice of your security committee, or whatever it is, without the recommendation rather of the security committee, what changed such that you and the Speaker arrived at that decision and clearly put it to the meeting?
Well, we were clearly of the view, based upon the advice that had been received, that a disruption was going to occur in Parliament House that day. And the advice included that the fact it would be a group of people, I think the figure of 10 was used, and some of them may be male, wearing concealing garments, and the best and the most immediate response was to enable us to ensure the identity of those people in the public gallery. Now, I think that was a prudent decision for that particular day, and let's bear in mind that was the last sitting day of a session. It was an interim measure, and it was going to impact on Parliament House for one day, and that's exactly what that decision in effect did. The Speaker and I have since met yesterday to revise that interim decision, which we've done, and that's become public this morning.
So why would you change the whole arrangements when you had clearly been given advice that there may be a disruption in one of the galleries on that day? Why didn't you just take some anticipatory action in terms of security in the gallery on that day rather than change the rules in the way that you have now made permanent changes to the rules in terms of passes? Why would you make a permanent change to the rules when you anticipated there was going to be a disruption in one place on one day?
Well, the nature of the information received indicated it was going to be people who had their faces covered. And so that was the interim immediate arrangement that we made, never intending it to be permanent, so we could then seek further advice, further information, and come up with what we now have as a second interim position. And we'll still seek further advice, and that the current interim arrangements may or may not continue. It will depend on what happens over the next short period.
This really doesn't make sense to me, in the sense that the ban on the passes, therefore, was that only for that day as well? An
interim decision, and we've continued that interim decision. That interim decision lasted until 8:30 this morning, and now we have a further set of measures that are in effect until such time as any other changes are made. In relation to security, Senator Milne, it's a fluid beast. Security changes rapidly, and we have to be responsive.
But wouldn't you, I mean, the issue of the passes, there is a rationale for it. It was made on the basis of advice from the committee put to you as part of that debate with the presiding officers. This third point was something that you and the Speaker determined yourselves.
Well, as we did the first 2 points, I mean, we weren't completely devoid of any involvement in the first 2 points. All 3 points were agreed to and discussed and debated by the Speaker and I, as well as others.
Okay, so did you seek advice from anyone in that particular meeting on the morning of the 2nd as to the efficacy of introducing such an interim measure with regard to facial covering? Did you seek advice from anyone expert in security at all?
Well, advice, as I indicated earlier, has been oncoming on a regular basis. This particular measure occurred, and the meeting occurred just after noon. Question time was commencing at 2. I think you could appreciate there was a degree of urgency in coming up with a temporary measure, which we did.
Yes, but I'm asking who with any sort of expertise in security imagined that this was a good idea?
Well, we had people from the Department of Parliamentary Services who have part of their title and their roles are security management of the building.
Yes, but we've already established that they don't have any expertise in security as such.
That was only in relation to the Black Rod and the Sergeant.
So who advised that this action on facial coverings was the appropriate way to deal with a anticipated disruption in one of the galleries?
Well, as I indicated earlier, Senator Milne, I'm not going to go into the detail of the discussion or the advice provided.
But we've not been able to establish that there was any advice at this point other than you and the Speaker reaching this decision, and that the Speaker has predominant responsibility and that's passed on to you. I haven't heard any clarity here as to any advice other than from the Speaker.
Well, advice was given to us and we've acted upon that advice and that discussion in that meeting.
Well, that's as far as I can
Senator
go.
Milne, just before you do, Senator Parry, for the record, you are formerly a police officer.
Correct.
So you are familiar with general security procedures?
Well, that would be a fair assumption, yes.
Thank you. Senator Wong.
Thank you. I just want to take this step by step. Okay, so we've established that there was advice provided to the Black Rod, which was then provided to your office and to you, that there was the possibility of a number of people entering the Parliament with facial coverings, but the evidence from the Black Rod is that she was not advised that there was an intention to disrupt question time. Correct? That was
I heard the evidence. That's
yes.
correct.
Okay. So, and her evidence is in the meeting that is subsequently called after a range of conversations at the Speaker's office, which include yourself, the Speaker, and staff of the departments. This issue is discussed. Correct?
Correct. There's one intervening step prior to that. Also, advice was received earlier than prior to me attending that meeting from the Speaker's office concerning the exact same incident. And that actually happened at the same time the Black Rod was in my office.
Right. And was that advice the same as the advice about which the Black Rod has given evidence?
Similar, yes.
Well, what was different?
Well, it involved information concerning potential disruption in Parliament House.
Okay. And from whom did you receive that advice?
That came from my senior advisor from the Speaker's office.
Right. And where had the Speaker's office received that information?
Well, that's then a matter for you to ask the Speaker, but we discussed these matters.
Well, what did you understand? I mean, you're the president of, you're the ranking parliamentary officer, presiding officer. You're making decisions based on that advice. Surely you have confirmed that this was credible advice.
Absolutely. What's
the source that renders it credible?
Well, I was satisfied with the advice that was received and what we discussed in the meeting, so that the interim measure I was satisfied with.
Was the advice from a security agency?
Well, I'm not going to discuss where the advice came from, Senator
Was
Wong.
the advice from the Prime Minister's office?
I'm not going to discuss
see,
where the advice came from.
This is the difficulty, Mr President, with respect. You put in place, with the Speaker, an interim arrangement which you've now had to back down on the basis, you say, of advice, but you're refusing to tell Parliament and the public whether or not that advice is grounded in any security advice. In fact, you're refusing to tell us where the advice comes from. This is in the context of the Black Rod, telling us that one of the options, which is the option you eventually chose, wasn't even included in the original DPS proposition. People are entitled to know. I understand there are, we are a responsible opposition when it comes to security matters. I'm not asking you. If you say this is classified, we won't go there. But I think people are entitled to know when you acted to change how our Parliament operates, the basis on which you did so.
I was satisfied, Senator Wong, at the time with the information that we received that this interim measure was warranted for that.
Who first told you that there was an intention to disrupt question time?
It came from two sources.
Where were the two sources?
The two sources were via the Black Rod.
That's not correct.
And via the Speaker's office.
Well, that is not correct. You should retract that evidence, Mr President. The evidence from the Black Rod is she was not told that there was an intention to disrupt question time. That is her clear evidence this morning. I asked her directly that question on more than one occasion.
Well,
she said, well, let me finish if I may. She says the first time she heard that was in the meeting with the Speaker's office. Therefore, the only basis on which you got advice that there was an intention to disrupt question time is via a phone call from the Speaker's office. And I'm asking you, how did you come to the view that that advice was from a credible source?
Well, firstly, I might ask the Black Rod if she wants to reflect on the conversation we had when we went from my office to the Speaker's office or to the House of Representatives side, where the Black Rod, a senior staff member, and I walked over there and discussed this matter. And that included partly where the advice of the Black Rod had come from. Now, the Black Rod was correct in her evidence that she didn't advise me in my office at that meeting concerning the information that she had received. And I'm not privy to the discussion she had with my senior advisor prior to that meeting. But we did discuss these matters as we walked across to the other side of the building. So
well,
we're not talking about formal meetings, Senator Wong. We're talking about an issue that was fluid, that we're receiving information upon as the issue unfolded. And then the Speaker and I, based upon all pieces of information that were coming to us on that day, made the decision we made.
I'm not asking about formal meetings, and obviously if the Black Rod wants to consider in a break whether or not there's anything she wishes to add, I mean, that courtesy is always extended. I'm asking a very simple question. I'm asking the basis of the advice. Was it from a political office or from a security agency? just that, that there was an intention to disrupt question time on the horizon.
And as I've indicated to previous senators and again to yourself, I'm not going to go into the nature of the advice, who provided the advice and what the advice contained.
Well,
I had to satisfy myself that the advice was okay.
Who came up with the idea for the additional paragraph? Could I ask you that?
Well, it was a discussion jointly in that meeting.
But who proposed it?
I'm not prepared to go there, Senator.
Right, so you're not prepared to tell the Parliament the basis of the assertion in your opening statement, which has not been referenced previously, that there was an intention to disrupt question time. You're not prepared, just hear me out. You're not prepared to tell Parliament what the basis of that is, and neither are you prepared to tell Parliament what the basis of the revised arrangements is. Whose advice that is? Just to be clear.
Well, that's correct, Senator Wong.
Okay.
I'm not
can I perhaps assist you?
No, Senator Wong,
Senator Wong, you've demanded that you be allowed to ask your questions without interruption. It's entitled for the President to respond to them without interruption. Senator Parry.
I'm not going to go down the path of opening up every meeting and every discussion that every officer is present, who provides what advice to whom, when. The critical aspect is the Speaker and I needed to be satisfied of the credibility of the information that was provided and to make an interim measure, and we did.
Well, Mr President, and nor would I ask you about every meeting and every piece of advice you get. That wouldn't be appropriate. I wouldn't ask you about that. But this is something about which there's been a great deal of concern. I asked you immediately on the day it was announced, which was not preceded by any consultation with any party leader. And I would have thought, if you are so keen to demonstrate that this was a credible decision based on credible advice, that you would not be so reticent in providing us with some basic information about who asserted to you and how it was credible that there was an intention to disrupt Parliament. But you've answered that. Can I perhaps assist you on this? When I asked you the question on the 2nd of October, you said that you put in place measures, interim measures, until we get a firm, and I'm quoting, until we get a firm set of advice from some key agencies, including the AFP and ASIO. Right? So I think it is a reasonable inference from that the decision to put in place the interim measures, which now have been backed down from, was not based on an AFP and ASIO advice. Well,
can I just address one aspect of that? The current measures that were put in place at 8:30 this morning,
well,
they're not. It's not a back down.
Okay.
It's a rearrange because we've now enhanced the identification
I'll rephrase
procedures.
the question. If you don't like back down, I'll rephrase it, Mr President. If you'd like me to do that, I'll rephrase it. I'll repeat the quote. These interim measures have been placed into the Parliament House precinct until we get a firm set of advice from some key agencies, including the AFP and ASIO.
That's correct.
Right, so at that stage, they had not advised you to do what you did, had they?
ASIO and AFP are continually advising us and the Security Task Force, and there are a lot of measures that we're receiving constant advice upon.
Did they ever, well, if they had advised you to do this, why would you have said to the Parliament that the measures had been put in place until you got advice from them?
Well, we're still getting further advice from those agencies.
Sure, because they hadn't advised you to do what you did, had they?
On that particular morning, ASIO and AFP were not involved in that decision.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that answer. So AFP and ASIO were not involved in that decision.
And that particular decision?
That particular decision. I'm only talking about that particular decision at the moment. I'm happy to ask about other things. In fact, there was no security agency person, representative present at the meeting in Ms Bishop's office, was there?
Not from those two agencies, no.
Were there other security?
No, there were security advisors from the Department of Parliamentary Services.
So I should make clear. There were DPS officials.
Correct.
And the Usher of the Black Rod, Sergeant-at-Arms and your personal staff, the Speaker and the President's personal staff, correct?
Correct.
But there were no AFP, ASIO or other external security agency representatives.
That's the total sum of those represented at the meeting.
And I'm putting to you I'm asking you whether it was your knowledge that the Speaker had been provided with a view as to the intention to disrupt via the Prime Minister's office?
Well, again, I'm not going to go into the details of discussions between
I'm
the
also-
Speaker and I or the officers or that meeting.
Sorry?
I'm not going to go into the details of those discussions.
Oh. But there were discussions between the Speaker and the Prime Minister's office?
I'm not aware of those.
All right. I'm also putting to you that the arrangement, the interim arrangement about which you've given evidence, was not part of the original DPS advice discussed in the meeting?
Well, that
I think that is
no, we've got to really clarify this, because that original DPS advice was based upon the presiding officers seeking that advice.
Sure.
Now, so every addition, every amendment, every aspect of that advice was refined, discussed and talked about. So there wasn't a set piece of advice and then an add-on. That was probably the draft when the Black Rod was involved, and she was absolutely correct with what she said. But that was just another added piece to
and
the
it was,
total
And it was added at your request?
All parts of that were at the presiding officer's request.
And where did you get the idea to have the people put behind glass?
Well, it wasn't having people put behind glass.
All right, having people sit behind glass. Where did you get that idea?
It was an option. We canvassed the options.
Where did you get the option
Just a moment,
from?
Senator Wong. We canvassed the options, and the option was that anyone who wished to view Parliament House, view Parliament proceedings in Parliament House, and did not wish to remove their facial coverings for the purpose of identity, could have the option of viewing in an enclosed gallery. And the rationale there was that disruptions could not be then heard in the chamber if people were going to disrupt, based upon the advice that was received earlier in the day.
So would it be fair to say that option was put in place at yours and the Speaker's request?
Well, all options were put in place at our either request or instigation.
Well, that's not quite right, because you can ask for advice. Advice, as I understand the evidence, is the draft advice has two options which you didn't choose. A third option, which ends up being the decision, is added. I'm simply confirming the third option is added at your request.
Well, all options were at our request or our instigation.
Okay.
Aren't school children in the enclosed gallery?
At times, but you'd probably identify, Senator Faulkner, that there's one gallery very rarely occupied. And I'm sure that the DPS would have used some good judgment and not placed people in the school children.
So there wasn't a risk then in your assessment that likely disruptors would be in the same enclosed gallery as school children visiting Parliament House?
No, not at all. I wouldn't have envisaged them being in the same glass enclosure.
Were any efforts made to ensure that didn't occur?
Well, Senator Faulkner, I would expect that the DPS would be professional enough to ensure that did take place.
Well, I don't have too many expectations of DPS, so what you're saying is no efforts were made to ensure that didn't occur?
Well, it's like everything. Presiding officers indicate policy, and we don't go and manage the fine detail of implementation.
I was always perplexed about that point from the minute I read or heard the original statement, and then read the information circular about this, what it meant for the school children behind the enclosed galleries. Anyway,
I would never have imagined that they would have been together at any point in time.
I see.
But that wasn't included in the circular?
No, but a lot of detail's not included in those things, Senator Wong.
Did anyone wearing facial covering actually seek to enter either Parliament House or the Chamber Gallery on the 2nd of October?
Not to my knowledge.
Right. Do you still maintain the advice is credible? Was credible?
Yes, at the time.
But you're not prepared to tell us why it was credible?
I was satisfied, as was the Speaker.
On what basis?
Well, that we were satisfied with the information we'd received.
Which wasn't from ASIO AFP nor from the Parliamentary Security Office?
The Parliamentary Security Office is part of DPS.
Yes.
No, I haven't said that.
So that DPS didn't provide that advice either?
Well, DPS provided a lot of advice, and as I said, Senator Wong, I'm not going to go into the detail of advice
but this is
provided.
important, Mr President.
It's all very important, Senator Wong, it's also important not to breach a long-standing convention that you do not discuss matters that committees and the presiding officers and others discuss that are of a private and secure nature.
No, but you've got to be reasonable about this, Mr President. What is discussed as a matter of course is where information or advice comes from. and the timing of such advice, but not necessarily the nature and content of that advice if matters are classified in some way. The process issues, to my knowledge, have always been discussed at estimates committees and in the Parliament, and I think that is perfectly reasonable for these process questions to be answered. There may be an issue about the substance of advice. There may be. I mean, it's not clear to me at the moment whether that's the case. But in relation to the detail of the technical details of the advice, when it was given, who gave it, and to whom, and so forth, these are just standard questions for Senate Estimates Committee. And I think you would know that that's the case. And many of Senator Wong's questions here go to that type of questioning.
And I think you'd have to agree, Senator Faulkner, I've been fairly liberal with a lot of my answers today.
Well, actually, Mr President, with respect, I don't. I mean, you've not indicated that the advice on which you predicated the decision was classified. You have confirmed it wasn't from a security agency, nor was it from, as I understand the evidence, from the parliamentary security. Is it officer? Was that the phrase?
Security Operations Manager.
Sorry, the Parliamentary Security Operations Manager. You and the Speaker made a very significant decision to change the arrangement of Parliament on the basis of advice. I would have thought it was not unreasonable for you to indicate where that advice came from.
I've already answered that, Senator Wong. I'm not going to go into the detail of the nature of the advice.
No, I'm not actually asking you about the nature.
Or where that advice came from and how that decision was made.
But that's, you see,
that's just
the nature of the advice is it seems to me, that there might be a reason not to provide that. That's a case-by-case issue. But in relation to these other processes, that seems to me to be quite straightforward. I don't understand what the problem with providing that information is. I'm not being disrespectful in this regard. I simply don't understand why you're unable to say to the committee where this, who provided this advice to you. It seems a perfectly straightforward question.
I've answered that to the best of my ability, Senator Faulkner, and I don't wish to add any further to that answer.
We haven't actually answered it, Mr President. And I would have thought you would want to demonstrate, if it is a credible basis of advice, that in light of the fact it's neither the Parliamentary Security Operations Manager, nor AFP, nor ASIO, where it is that the advice as to disruption comes from that is so credible that leads you to impose the substantial change on parliamentary procedure that you did.
An interim change that had an effect for one day.
When the change to the security arrangements on the 2nd of October were made, which are effectively the three issues that we've discussed, the decision there was made in the Speaker's office. That's correct, isn't it?
Correct.
I think you've indicated that that's the case. Can you say when this was finally agreed by yourself and the Speaker, who was present?
All of the people that have been mentioned before, all the agencies and the compilation.
Could you just go through, just for clarity's sake, could you
Department
please?
of Parliamentary Services.
Yep.
A variety of officers.
Yep.
The Department of the Senate, represented by the Black Rod. The Department of the House of Representatives, represented by the Sergeant at Arms. And myself, the Speaker, and our staff.
And what, sorry?
And our staff.
Okay.
The staff of the
President,
presiding
Speaker
officers.
and staff, right. Can I ask the Black Rod, did you keep any formal record of that meeting when the decision was finally made?
I've got a file note.
A file note?
Of my attendance at that meeting.
Yeah.
Yep.
Would it be, could I ask whether it would be possible that that file note be provided to the committee, please? Thank you.
Yes.
Sorry, not the file, a copy of the file note.
Yes.
Senator Faulkner, before we go to a break at 10:30, Senator Milne has an additional question, so I'd ask you to conclude for this moment.
Sure.
Senator Milne.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. President, you said a minute ago that that third point of the interim order was for just 1 day, but you didn't make that clear at the time, nor did you make it clear after the event until today that you were revoking that. At what point did you make a decision to revoke the point 3? And secondly, did you receive any request from the Prime Minister's office or from any other ministerial office to revoke that decision?
To your last point first, no, I did not receive any request from the Prime Minister's office or any minister's office to, in your words, to revoke that provision. Going back to your first point, you may recall, and it's in Hansard, that I indicated in response to a question from Senator Wong that this was an interim measure only, a temporary measure, and by extension, without defining the dates, the only day the Parliament was sitting until we've had this measure was that day, the 2nd of October, Thursday the 2nd of October. And to answer further to that question where you asked and what prompted us to, I'll use your words, revoke the particular clause C, that was because we could then, we've introduced a new measure where facial identification will take place at the point of entry into the building, thereby reducing the issues in relation to people entering the building whom we're not aware of who they are, and in case there are people who are banned from the building or people who may be a known security threat or detected as a security threat by uncovering their face. So that was the reason, because the front door method has now been improved, which enables us to have more confidence of people being able to mix in the gallery with facial coverings.
But my question relates to, if it was for only 1 day, why didn't you say that at the time? And now it's a convenient explanation in hindsight, but the furor that occurred could have been dealt with immediately if you had made a point that this was to deal with one potential disruption on 1 day of the Parliament, in which case you would have had to answer the question as to why you would change the security measures for one incident that you anticipated. My second, in relation to your saying you didn't have any correspondence from the Prime Minister, are you aware whether the Speaker has had any request or correspondence from the Prime Minister or any other ministerial office to revoke the decision?
Well, that's a matter for the Speaker and those other officers.
Okay.
Mr Chair, perhaps over the break, the President could consider something, and then because I'm sure you have other people who want questions before you come back to me. I could be lucky, of course. It was being reported in the Australian that, and I quote, in relation to this, the Prime Minister's office rang the Department of Parliamentary Services to warn of an impending protest inside Parliament by people wearing burqas. A spokesman for the Prime Minister confirmed yesterday the call was made by a staff member. Were you aware of that?
Well, I'm not going to comment on a media report. I've read the report.
The Prime Minister's office appears to have confirmed it.
Well, that's a matter for the Prime Minister's office.
But you're not prepared to tell Senate estimates if it's true?
I'm not aware of that, and that's a media report, Senator Wong.
You're not aware of any communication by the Prime Minister's office to your department?
Well, would I be aware of correspondence or a communication from the Prime Minister's office to the Department of Parliamentary Services? I'm not aware,
okay,
and it hasn't been brought to my attention.
I just would point out that the question was asked of Senator Parry earlier about that he or his staff had any communications with the Prime Minister's office.
Sorry, I thought they meant personal staff, Chair. Yeah.
And it may well have, but it being 10:30, the committee will now suspend until 10:45 and will resume with the Department of the Senate.